Okay, so today we're going to look at another early civilization, which is in Northeast Asia in what is modern-day China, just to continue our case examples of early civilizations in the sort of China's first so-called civilization, which had historical documentation and writing, is known as the Shang period. And just to begin, one of the big questions that we do have to ask is, how should we understand early Chinese civilization? Um, the reason why that question is actually important is because the big question that we always been asking over the last couple of sessions is, what is the basis for civilizational development, right? Could it be urbanization, for example, the development or was it agriculture? So that would be the first question that we would need to ask when we are confronting, a potential case study or potential sort of case that we could qualify as a civilization. So what was the basis for early Chinese culture to be qualified as a civilization? The second question, which is an interesting, more of a historiographical question, is there any nationalistic element to qualifying a culture as a civilization? And we have to realize that when it comes to history, um, there is always an agenda that's behind the articulation of some of these sorts of issues. So, civilization being sort of that qualification of a high mark of achievement can sometimes be utilized as part of a national narrative, right, of the past in order to sort of bolster the current or the present nation state. So sometimes we have to think about that as a possible sort of question that we might need to think about too. So if we think about the chronology of early Chinese history, it's pretty interesting because Chinese historians have been able to sort of trace it all the way back to several millennia, like beginning with the Neolithic cultures from about the 6th millennium BC onwards down to about the 3rd millennium BC. And these highly developed Neolithic cultures would then culminate ultimately into what was known as the First Dynasty of China, which is known as the Xia Dynasty, dated to 2070 BC, right? Followed by the Shang Dynasty in 1600 BC. And when we look at the Chinese historiography or the Chinese historical chronology, then what follows is a very systematic sort of dynasty after one after another through the last 3,000 years, all the way up until today, when we look at the People's Republic of China under the Chinese Communist Party. So this chronology, which is very conveniently what we call teleological, so kind of like a telescopic view, right? From here to there into the past, it's sort of a single continuous line, can be seen as a historiographical kind of narrative about the lastability of Chinese culture, the longevity of the state, and those sorts of things. So it's really interesting when we think about it as a historiographical issue. But the interesting characteristic about Chinese civilization is that it is actually pretty late compared to some of the other case studies that we've already seen, right? So if we think about Mesopotamia, for example, that we saw a couple of sessions ago, the early civilizations in the Fertile Crescent and in Mesopotamia really came out by about the 4th millennium BC, right? And even in the case of Egypt, for example, by the late 4th millennium BC and the early 3rd millennium BC is where we see the Egyptian civilization really sort of beginning to flourish with all the monumental architecture, the articulation of religion, and even the development of writing. All of that comes by about the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC. In the last session where we looked at the Indus Valley civilization, the high point of the Indus Valley civilization already emerged by the time we got to the mid 3rd millennium BC. So in that sense, the Chinese civilization, because it kind of pretty much begins around about 1600 BC, okay, is quite late, okay? But what we can note, though, is that there are some really interesting characteristics about early Chinese civilization that we sort of don't really quite see as clearly in these other three case studies that we've looked at so far. And the first one, obviously, is the continuation of the Neolithic period practices, but this time at a much larger scale. And these include, for example, the stamped earth platforms, where you have raised platforms, right, that are created by putting earth and dirt together and then sort of pounding them with poles so that you create a compressed sort of earth layer, and you do it over multiple times, and you create a raised platform. And that's part of how the housing structures and the larger sort of structures within a Neolithic settlement was built in China. That continues into the early civilizations phase. The other, or the second sort of continuation, would have been the burial practices that were already conducted or sort of practiced by the Neolithic period, and that is the location of burials and the burial sites outside of the areas where the living people would have been, active, right? So the idea that the dead people would be interred in a completely different area, usually outside of the walls of a village. And the third one being the nature of the material culture that they developed in the Neolithic period, including things like ceramics and all that sort of stuff, being a continuation into the early civilizations phase. So if we think about that and looking at this image or this map that's on your right-hand side of the screen, we had talked about this a few weeks ago when we were looking at Neolithic period man, right? And how certain kinds of, sort of settlement patterns were beginning to emerge, including, for example, the fact that you would have had, dwellings located within a wall, okay? But also that the cemeteries and the burial sites would actually be located outside of the residential compound areas. And you also had much larger, architectural features, indicating buildings that are much larger than, say, the domestic dwellings, right? Your typical homes that you would have seen, including these ones, for example. Okay. What is really interesting about the Neolithic period, of course, was the development of large-scale agriculture in North China. So by about the 7th and 6th millennium BC, in places such as Chishan, for example, in North China, you saw the building of storage capacities, kind of granary buildings that could hold up to about 70,000 kilograms of millet, right? That became sort of the norm in terms of the agricultural culture, right, of the Chinese Neolithic period. What you saw, though, through the course of the Neolithic period into the civilization period or the historic period, was a move from an egalitarian society to a society that became increasingly stratified, right? Part of the reason had to do with the fact that large-scale agriculture allowed North Chinese communities to develop large populations. But along with that, and the limitations of resources, including things like water, for example, and the availability of arable land, meant that you needed to exercise some kind of control over collective resources so that agriculture could be well conducted, well developed, and then everybody, the community population will be doing well. And so the result of that was that you get the development of control mechanisms. Now, in some places, the control mechanisms could come easily through things like, for example, the building or the implementation of coercive arm, right? The sort of, a police force or something like that, right? Or you could use land ownership, right, of families that had already been in the land for a long time, and so sort of claim ownership as a means of articulating, collective control, right, of resources. But in the case of China, religion or religious beliefs became the means or the mechanism by which societal control could be exacted. So what does it look like, right? When we think of the early Chinese civilization period, which began around about 1600 BC under the Shang Dynasty, what was really interesting is that we're looking at a Neolithic settlement. You think about the walls, think about the different locations of things that are happening, including, for example, the kilns here. You had animal husbandry located in very specific areas, and then, of course, residential areas in certain parts of this large extended village, and of course, the walls as well. By the time you get into the early civilization period, around about 1600 BC, you see that, except that it's at a much larger scale. So whereas the Neolithic villages, as much as they were large, right, with several hundred people in each of them, okay, by the time you got to 1600 BC, you're really looking at a much more larger expression of those sorts of settlement patterns you saw in the Neolithic period. So the city of Changzhou, which is the capital city of the Shang Dynasty, was fairly large with a total area of about 25 kilometers square. So it's a huge place. What is interesting, of course, is that some features from the Neolithic period was continued into the early civilizations period here, right? So the first one of which would be the building of settlement or perimeter walls, right? So the whole city, which was fairly large, was essentially enclosed by a perimeter wall on about almost three sides, with the fourth essentially being, sort of demarcated by a lake, which is no longer there today, but obviously in about 1600 BC, the lake was there, and that formed essentially the perimeter of this very, very extended or large city. The second thing that's really interesting, of course, is the buildings themselves that are within this big city itself, and that would be the buildings that are demarcated by these rectangles here within a palace wall, but they were constructed of the same technique as of the Neolithic period, and that is the stamped platforms, right? So these buildings are quite large compared to the Neolithic period, but the techniques that they employed were pretty much the same. Some of these buildings were about 100 meters square to 2,000 meters square, and you think of it in terms of a comparison, an Olympic-sized pool with 8 swimming lanes, like the one that we have at the NAU Sports Complex, is roughly about 1,250 square meters in terms of its surface area. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the size of some of these large buildings. They were pretty large, and they required a huge amount of manpower mobilization in order for them to be able to be built. Okay, the third thing that is really interesting about the early civilization cities, right, of North China is the specialization of economic activity. So there were bone factories, for example, there were pottery workshops and bronze foundries as well. But what is interesting is that they were located, right, in areas that were very specific to the kind of activities that were conducted. So here, for example, is where the bronze foundry, one of the bronze foundry in the city was located, right? And what is very, very fascinating is that when this kind of activity is there, right, there was also a residential area nearby, which suggests that the people who lived there likely worked in those foundries, and they probably were buried nearby as well in that same area. So in other words, what you had was an entire sort of community, right, that revolved around a single, economic activity, such as the production of bronze and bronze items. So in other words, social mobilization was a big deal when it came to the early civilizations of North China, as it was by the time you got to the Neolithic period in North China. Okay, so this is an interesting development in terms of the early civilization of China by about 2000 BC. So if we zoom into this space here, where all the main massive buildings are located, this is a zoom in on the left of a cluster of so-called palace buildings. We suspect it's palace buildings because of the size that we're looking at, right? So there's a water pool at the top, obviously for bathing, water supply, and all that kind of thing. Ceremonial areas, because there's a large hall where likely there would have been reception, right, by the ruler or the political elite and dealing with things. But more importantly, you had these buildings here, all of which were built on raised platforms. And the way that they constructed it is like this. If you look at a cross-section of a wall from this particular city, it gives you a sense of how the construction is done. They would have basically stepped the earth layer by layer with many people, you throw earth there and you would be pounding and pounding until that layer of dirt became very, very compressed and hard. Then you add another layer of dirt and you would do that and you would repeat that process all the way until you got up to about the height that you would want the structure to be, right? And then that would be the raised platform, right, on which a building would be constructed. And this particular image or picture of this wall structure in the city of Zhangzhou is a good example of that. You can, I think, almost see the horizontal layers of earth that were utilized, right, to sort of form this wall through the stamped earth technique. So this is a really old sort of, prehistoric, Neolithic technique that was continued into the second millennium BC. One would almost imagine that the level of technology was actually not necessarily extremely high, right, for something of this nature. But what is really important is that you really needed a lot of human labor, right, in order to be able to produce something like this. So the hallmark of early Chinese civilization, frankly, more than anything else, seems to be, right, the control and the deployment of large-scale labor force. So in other words, the population had to be very large in order for you to be able to do some of these infrastructure projects that we are seeing here. Okay, that practice continues all the way through into about 1200 BC, right, when this early civilization in North China, the Shang Dynasty, becomes, sort of increasingly well articulated, and the level of what we call the civilizational characteristics are extremely well entrenched, right? Sometime around about 1300 BC, the Shang Dynasty that was ruling this civilization up in North China decides to move their capital eastwards from the city of Zhangzhou to another location about 200 miles towards the east, and they called it Yin City, located in modern-day Anyang province in North China. And what is interesting about this city compared to Zhangzhou, okay, if we go back to this map, right, is a couple of characteristics that are now significantly different compared to the earlier city that was established in 1600 BC. Okay, the first major difference, obviously, is the absence of a external perimeter wall. So whereas the city of Zhangzhou had a very extensive external perimeter wall to encompass this 25-kilometer square area, okay, that formed the city of Yin, which is the second capital on the sort of 200 miles away eastwards, had no external perimeter wall. In other words, the city was what we would consider an open city. Okay, and that's really important because it does suggest two things. Number one, that there was a move away from the Neolithic practice of settlements that we saw, right, where there would be a perimeter wall around the settlement, okay, as a means of protecting, right, your residential spaces, probably your agricultural resources, and so on and so forth, and your key important buildings. By this point in time, it would seem like the Shang Dynasty was so powerful or strong or prevalent in North China that they no longer needed to have a protective wall, right, to surround themselves so that they would be safe. So in other words, their control, or at least their influence across the whole of North China, was a lot more pervasive, right, and extensive than during the 1600 BC period. So that's one. The second one that was really interesting is that when we look at the landscape of the city here, it is primarily dominated by a number of key features. Of course, you would have the palace area, which is located here, okay? But more importantly, this entire city looked like a mausoleum, right? So you had three major features, all right, that sort of mark this urban landscape. And that would be this one here. And then there will be another one here. And then a third one here, which is located here. Okay. In the city wall itself, right? And a fourth one that's located here. Plus a whole series of scattering of these other sort of, spaces, all of which, by the way, are burial sites. And so what really is interesting is that the landscape by about 1300 BC began to be dominated essentially by graveyards. And that appeared to be one of the most important functions and characteristics of the city here in terms of the Shang civilization. Okay. Accompanying that was the location of the commonest settlements. So in other words, not the political elite, right, but the ordinary people. And the ordinary people were essentially living in very close proximity to, okay, these massive grave sites, right, including, for example, in this area here, okay, this area here, right, and so on and so forth. You can actually see it occurring across the entire landscape. And these are quite similar to the 1600 BC city of Changzhou, in that they were clustering around, key economic activities, right, including, for example, the workshops for bronzes and so on and so forth. But it almost feels like, from a spatial point of view, these spaces, right, were essentially located and interacting and servicing, okay, the graves or the grave sites that were located within their vicinity. So what is it about this, sort of burials that seem to be pretty important in terms of early Chinese civilization by the time you got to about 1300 BC? Okay, so think of the case study that we had on Egyptian civilization, for example, where these burial tombs, the pyramids, right, and the large temple sites, for example, were primarily the focal point, right, of any urban form or urban settlement in ancient Egypt. So in other words, society revolved around, right, religion, and the focal or physical focus and focal points of religion in the early Egyptian civilization were the temples, the burial sites, and the pyramids that were built, right, along the River Nile, so that would be what everybody would be working on collectively together. And in North China, there was a fairly similar situation that was going on by the time you got to about 1300 BC. And so when we zoom in from this space, all right, let me just show it to you. So if we think about this space here, this space here, yeah, and you zoom into that, this is what that area of the city of Yin actually looks like. Essentially, is a massive graveyard, all right, that comprises two kinds of grave sites, right? There are these really large sort of graves that have this almost like a cross, like a crucifix kind of a, kind of a shape, sort of indicating the cardinal directions of the compass, sort of general cardinal direction of the compass, because of course this is north, right? So the magnetic north is pointing in that direction. So all these sites are kind of oriented in a way which is north-south oriented, with an east-west entrance into it, okay? So all of these are individual grave sites. So this is one grave site, for example, right? This is another grave site, for example, and then this is a third one, and so on and so forth, right? These are fairly large. If you think about that, each of them, some of them are actually longer, about twice the length of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that's kind of pretty huge. But the other thing that is really interesting is that you also have these clusters of much smaller grave sites next to them. And so what you have is a stratified society that has essentially two levels of society. The ones that are the socio-political elite, the really sort of top 1-2% of the population that not only commanded and controlled the population, but probably commanded and controlled all the resources that this population and this society and civilization produced. Those would have been interned, right, into these big and lavish tombs here, for example, or here, right? And then you have a second group of this particular civilization who are the commoners, right, your ordinary people, who probably form like the 95% of the population. And they were the ones that would have worked on the construction of the tombs, but then ultimately would have been interned in these little sort of graves here. And each of these graves, according to the archaeological report, did not just contain one body. These pits could contain as many as 5 to 20 human remains in there. So that means that these were mass grave and mass pits that were dug and people were interned in there. So this city was essentially a city of death, right? Everything that was done was in preparation for the internment of these tombs. And then along with that was the sacrifice of people or commoners that were constructing these tombs. As the dead was being buried, they would then also be interned into these little grave pits as part of human sacrifice, right, that accompany the burial ceremonies of the socio-political elite. So here's a image of an excavation of one of these huge tombs for the socio-political elite. As you can tell, it's extremely deep. So there's a huge amount of earth that had to be removed, and then a central sort of little core in the bottom where it would be lined very often with wooden planks to form like a burial chamber, and then in it the body would be interned along with a whole bunch of grave goods as well. Okay, and so the industry of the city was mobilized, right, apart from obviously agriculture, so that you could maintain a large population, but was mobilized for the production of grave goods. So bronze items, for example, right, which were extremely large, right, very, very heavy because of the amount of bronze that would have been utilized, were essentially being made by large village communities, right, that had the requisite skills for smelting bronze, mining the bronze, the copper ore, as well as the lead, and then sort of fluxing them and then creating what is a bronze alloy so that you could then create molds and produce these bronze items. So a huge mobilization of manpower, right, in order to be able to fill some of these tombs with the requisite amount of grave goods that were needed, right? And these grave goods would probably have contained things like wine, for example, also agricultural products like grain. They all look like containers. And so that was what they would have been utilized for. But it also had a whole bunch of things which I don't have a close-up image of, so I do apologize for that. But these, for example, are jade artifacts, right? The stones, the raw materials came from Central Asia across, from the West, which would have entailed significant amount of trade so that you could pay for these things across great distances. But once they arrived, your artisans would work on them. And jade is one of the hardest stones in the world. So the skill level and the time that was needed in order to produce some of these religious artifacts for the internment, right, in this tomb took a lot of time as well, a lot of manpower, and a lot of skill as well. So the whole society was mobilized basically for the preparation of this tomb, right? And you can tell from the amount of resources spent that whoever was interned in this tomb was probably somebody of extremely high social status, right? The person who, for whom this burial pit was prepared, actually lies here. Okay, and she was the consort of the ruler. At least for this tomb, we know her identity. She was the consort of the ruler of the Shang Dynasty, so basically the ruler of this North Chinese civilization. And along with her were a couple of maidservants, little girls that were killed and then placed in the tomb so that they would become her servants in perpetuity as she died, right? Their souls would also accompany her to the afterlife and serve her basically in the afterlife. So entire society was essentially mobilized, right, for the benefit of the small proportion of socio-political elite in this society, especially in terms of the preparations of them as they moved from the living world into, right, the world of the dead, right, or the afterlife. And part of what they developed as a means of social control, of course, was the religion. Okay, and the way that they expressed their religion was through animism, which is sort of a very rudimentary kind of belief that basically held that all living things, including spirits, right, existed on a single plane of existence. So, in other words, we all sort of share the same space, both the seen as well as the unseen world, right? But in order for them to express the characteristics of the concept of the unseen world, they utilize the features of the natural world, including animals, for example, and then imbued it with some kind of like sacredness or mysteriousness, right, to sort of convey the notion of the spiritual world and that which was unseen. So here's a very good example. For example, you have a bronze item that is trying to convey that spiritual notion of animism. Okay, and so you have the head, for example, what looks like a cow, right? It's on a really short body, okay, with a stubby tail that looks like it might have been a pig, a dog or something like that. Doesn't really look like the tail of a cow, but then having these interesting horns that don't look like cow horns at all, right? And so, you have this composite zoomorphic iconography to sort of convey that notion, right, of the spirit realm, which is sort of animal based. And so the religion is very rudimentary in that sense, right? But the expression of it in terms of the material culture requires a significant amount of manpower mobilization. But part of the control mechanism was that religion was the be all and end all. Okay. And whoever was able to essentially control how that religion operated became basically the person by which social or societal control could be exercised across the Shang, sort of cultural sphere or the Shang dynastic civilization. And so writing became one of those things as a means of expressing, right, not only the beliefs and the cultural beliefs, but also a means of essentially exacting control over people. Okay, so in early China, what happened was writing very early on was developed by about 1500 BC. It's these pictographic scripts that kind of look like, almost pictures, but in some ways it's a formal language, right? The language really utilized only for one very simple purpose, and that was to ask divination questions. So questions such as, should I go hunting today, right? Am I going to have a male child? My wife is expecting, am I going to have a male child, right? Do we expect that there would be a comet that is going across the sky, right? The kind of calendric cycle and the recording of, astronomical sort of phenomenon as we that we know. So all these questions were then articulated in written form onto a bone. And there's a reason why they call oracle bone languages. So the bones are not just any bones, right? They are this scapula or the shoulder blade bones of a cow, right? Or the underbelly of a tortoise shell. Okay. So now tortoise shell obviously is extremely rare because it has come from the sea. And the Shang Dynasty is an inland dynasty, right? An inland civilization in North China. And so these tortoise shells have to be imported from the south where it's a bit warmer, and then it's along the coastline. And so people hunt for these turtles and these tortoises, and then they would kill the animal. They'll prepare the shells, and then they would send it up to the Shang Dynasty up in the north part of China. Or you could be raising cattle, but each cow, right, only has two shoulders. So every cow, which is like around about almost 1,000 kilograms, each of these cows are really huge, really can only produce 2 shoulder blades. So these bones are extremely expensive. So on the one hand, the resources needed for the divination, right, is extremely expensive. But at the same time as well, the command and control in terms of the ability to write, right, and express these sorts of questions, right, divination questions, was limited to a very small group of people in this society and culture, right? And that was the high level of the ruling elite. They were the only ones who had access to the bones. And then they were also the only ones that had access to the written language. And so therefore, you became basically whoever had the ability to write and to ask these questions would then be able to essentially say that I have a means of communicating with the spirit realm. And so because of that, right, I am much greater than any of the common people that are around in this civilization. And so command and control of the society was essentially tied very closely and intimately to the ability, right, to do divination. And so therefore command and control the religion for the purpose of societal control, which is actually quite interesting because that is very different from what, for example, in Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, where language was initially developed, right, as a means of writing down or recording accounts of trade and commercial exchange, which then eventually developed into a writing, right, the known as the cuneiform, okay, and highly stylized for the purpose of writing down law codes so that commercial transactions, right, could be adjudicated by law. So in the case of the Fertile Crescent, trade was the most important thing, right? And money was the most important thing. And so because of that, the language was developed over time in order to record as well as to administer, right, commercial exchanges and economic exchanges. And so that's the basis for the development of language. That also was the basis, right, of social control and social hierarchy, right, in the Fertile Crescent. And that became basically the means by which social hierarchy and, rulership was articulated. Whereas in the case of China, religion in the first instance was what was important. And so language was developed as a means of divination, right, in an animist belief system, which eventually became the reason for controlling society so that you could have, right, these sorts of expressions, right, where burials became the most important be-all and end-all societal control. And so social hierarchy and rulership was expressed, right, as a manifestation, right, of religion and religious beliefs. And language became a means by which you could do that as well. So what is really interesting, of course, is that the Shang civilization really was located in a relatively small part of North China. It's not really very large. The Shang heartlands for this civilization was not really very, very big. Okay. But they were so prolific that their cultural influence across the whole of the Chinese landmass was pretty extensive. So much so that by about 1300 BC, at the height of the Shang Dynasty and Shang civilization, right, you actually found vestiges of cultural, sort of artifacts and certain kinds of burial practices, for example, that extended to a much larger space, right, across the whole of North China compared to where the Shang Dynasty was located, which is in that much smaller circle here. Okay. And so as a culture, they were quite influential across North China. As a state, they were relatively small. And so really the question is, are they really a civilization? If you think about civilization. In some ways we could, I guess, when we think about this and comparatively with the Fertile Crescent, where it's essentially a conglomeration of many, many, many different city-states of different sizes, but they all shared a similar culture, right? In the case of North China, one could argue that by about 1300 BC, the Shang Dynasty essentially was a sort of cultural civilization, right, that had a fairly large sphere, and that the shared culture, or at least certain aspects of its shared culture, right, was practiced by the people across a much larger geographical area up in North China than just the boundaries of the political entity of the Shang Dynasty. So the implications are pretty interesting, right, when we think about it. So on the one hand, culture can be an overwhelming force in terms of a system of control. And then in terms of the articulation of what we would call the confidence in cultural articulation, so much so that there might not be the need to actually have defensive features such as a wall, right, to demarcate where your culture or civilization ended and where it began. Okay, so the city of Yin in 1300 AD, 1300 BC is a really good example of that, where the city itself, the cityscape, did not have a wall, right? So there is no wall in this second city when the Shang Dynasty and Shang civilization is at its peak. Okay. Second thing, of course, is the practice of ritual and the afterlife, right? And the beliefs in the afterlife. In that it was an important means by which mass scale social control could be exerted. So on the one hand, you're controlling society at a large scale so that you are able to have the resources in order to practice and reinforce this whole ritual belief, right, of the afterlife, right, of the spiritual beliefs that you have in terms of animism, the divination, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that need, right, the impetus to exert mass scale social control also then led to the ability to be coercive, right, in order to control society from a political point of view. Okay. And so religion, afterlife, became the means by which mass scale social control could be exerted in this part of China by the time you got to the second half of the second millennium BC. And the third thing is language, right, which was developed to reinforce social control. Because only the elite and the educated, right, were able to acquire the language capability, but more importantly, were also then the only ones that could utilize the language in any meaningful way. And in this case, it was, for the purpose of divination and asking questions of the spirits so that you could get an answer and be able to do things, right, with a confidence that the common man didn't have. And so language development and acquisition was one of the most important things as well in terms of societal control. So what do we think about the Shang civilization there? And in terms of, some of the thoughts that we had in terms of early civilizations, as we've been looking at 3 case studies now, and this is the 4th. So the basis for qualifying, this North Chinese culture of the Shang Dynasty as an early civilization, was it based on technological advancements? In some ways, I would say not really, because the technological knowledge of such things as, bronze casting, for example, even the artistry that was developed was quite rudimentary in the case of China. I mean, it does look kind of spectacular, but because these are fairly common, technological capabilities, by the time you got to the 3rd millennium BC, the early Chinese civilization didn't really have any uniqueness in terms of their technological advancement. The artistic developments as well were pretty unique, but nonetheless, they weren't necessarily what we would consider, extremely, extremely sophisticated. If you think about these things, for example, right? They're nice, they look really good, right? But I don't know if you would consider them as the high point, right, of artistic, expression and development. One would have thought, for example, that the ancient Egyptians probably did a much better job at acquiring or attaining a high level, right, of artistry than, say, for example, the early Chinese civilization did. But what we can say is the centralization of power, where the entire society across a large space, right, existed for the purpose of ensuring that the socio-political elite and their members, had the proper burial needs so that they could do well, not just in this life, but in the afterlife. And from that point of view, totalitarian control, right, that your life didn't matter, that all of the community's lives didn't matter, and it was the socio-political elite that really ultimately mattered, meant that they were able to exert totalitarian control very early on. And you don't see that necessarily, for example, in the Indus Valley, where it looked like society was a lot more egalitarian and everybody sort of chipped in to help. There wasn't a well-articulated social hierarchy where it was obvious that, the top, tier of the social hierarchy were essentially in control of everybody else and, exploiting everybody. You do not necessarily see that too in the case of Mesopotamia, even though there was a state, there was a ruler, right? There was a religious class, but nonetheless, that social hierarchy didn't come across as a society that essentially control, right, the lives of everybody under them. Okay, there's some sense of that perhaps in Egypt, right? But that notion comes more from the biblical account of Egypt, ancient Egypt, right, with the slave period, right, of the Jews and the Hebrews under Ramses II, as opposed to actual expressions of slavery. So the Chinese case is really the only one where we can see very clearly totalitarian control, right, where everybody's lives didn't matter. It was the socio-political elite that were important, and that everybody's lives were essentially utilized for the construction of tombs, right, and the grave goods. And then when the tombs are interred, you would basically kill everybody else that was working on it, right, and bury them as part of ritual sacrifice, right? So thousands of people would have been sacrificed for the burial of a single, right, socio-political elite member. So totalitarian control. So when we think of early civilizations, we often just think of like urbanization, technological achievements, right, artistic developments and other kind of thing, agricultural and economic, developments. But it may be useful for us to think of the ability to control, right, totalitarian control and centralization of power as another factor or manifestation through which we can qualify a culture in the early historic period as a civilization, which I think in the case of China is probably what we are looking at. So I'm going to leave that with you. And the next session will be looking at Minoan civilization, which is a alternative case study to sort of counteract all of these things that we've seen so far in the 4 case studies that we've looked at of the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and China. Can we think of civilizations, in a almost completely different way? Okay, so I'll leave that with you, and I'll see you in the next class session.